Good evening, everyone. I am recording this PowerPoint for our flipped class lecture for tomorrow. I encourage you to listen to the PowerPoint as I will be doing the lecture over the PowerPoint and moving each of the slides forward as we go. The challenge is that with the Screencast-O-Matic, as this is recorded over the PowerPoint, you won't be able to click the action buttons on each of the slides. So you'll have to download the actual PowerPoint from our shared class files. So there'll be two versions. There'll be the one with the MP3 version that has the link to my voiceover, as well as the one that is the original PowerPoint that has the links, so that you can just click on the links to view the videos. The video that's particularly important for you to watch is the one on dialectic behavior therapy by Marsha Linehan, which is one of the last links to click on. Please be sure to watch that video, as it is an actual session of her conducting DBT. She is the founder and creator of DBT, so it's a very informative session with a client who is abusive and aggressive to his partners, and she does a really nice job in that of stopping at different moments throughout the session to explain those elements of DBT as she's using them. So please take some time to watch that, as that will be the essence of the message board that I will be posting in our class. So moving along, the first thing that we're going to talk about is some terms and definitions. And one of the things to keep in mind is that when we refer to something like psychotherapy, psychotherapy can refer to any one of a number of different counseling modalities. Any kind of cognitive behavior therapy is considered psychotherapy. Psychotherapy can exist in the terms of psychodynamic interventions, which we'll talk about next week. So psychotherapy in itself is a form of, or a term that is used to mean general counseling. So one of the things that you'll start to see as we go through each of these different types of theories and theoretical modalities that then translate into therapeutic approaches is that oftentimes they're talking therapies, and it's just subtle nuances of the way the clinician uses themselves, chooses the questions to ask, as well as chooses those topics that they continue to explore and dig further into with a client, that really it is the essence of the difference between, say, a cognitive behavioral intervention, a straight behavioral intervention, a psychodynamic intervention, or a short-term solution-focused intervention. And we'll talk more about this in class when we meet again, but one of the things I think you'll start to see is that there's subtle nuances that really make the difference between how you assess a client, but then also how you choose the different therapy approaches you're going to use. So some of the terms that you'll see when we talk about behavior interventions and behavior theory is that, behavior theory is really based on the ideas of sort of classical as well as operant conditioning, and the idea of how we condition responses to certain stimuli, whether those are natural stimuli, such as classical conditioning when you think of Pavlov's dogs that had the saliva responses and the salvonic responses to a non-traditional ringing of a bell, which would not normally have had the dog salivate, right? And then you have the operant conditioning, which is the learning of behaviors through positive and or negative reinforcements. And when you think of cognitive interventions and cognitive therapies, we're thinking about how we change behaviors and how we do that through changing the way we think about certain things or the way we feel about certain things. And so three different types of therapies that go along with cognitive theory are rational motive behavior therapy, and cognitive therapy. Because even though the rational motive behavior and rational behavior therapy both look at concentrating the changes in behaviors, those changes in behaviors happen through a better and deeper understanding of emotional reactions to behaviors, as well as cognitive, which is your thought process related to those behaviors. So when we think about cognitive theory, we're thinking about Piaget, right? And Piaget was talking about schemas, and the schema is really the building block of our mental representations of the world. So when we think about children and we think about a young child who sees a horse and calls it a dog, that's because her schema has been created around a four-legged creature that walks is a dog. And so anything that is a four-legged creature then gets assimilated into that schema or mental representation of the world. And so as we learn and evolve and have more experiences, our schemas become more sophisticated, and our representations of the world and our stimuli around us then also change. The process, though, for changing a schema exists in three ways. There's either assimilation, in which new information that we obtain fits with an existing schema. So, for example, when a child sees a chihuahua and calls it a dog, then that new information of a chihuahua gets assimilated with this idea of dog. Now, when you think about something like accommodation, and that child who saw a horse called it a dog, and the guardians or parents explain to that child that that is actually a horse, now the child needs to accommodate that new information and alter the schema to understand that not all four-legged animals are dogs, but there are multiple different types of four-legged animals, one of which could be a horse, and that's considered accommodation. And then if a child sees a chihuahua and the mom says, yes, that is a dog, then that creates the equilibrium of the schema, which means that the child doesn't necessarily have to change the way she thinks about or defines dog in terms of her mental representation. So as children grow, it's similar to the Ericksonian stage theories, there are stages of cognitive development that Piaget presented. And those stages of cognitive development are, as you can see, sorry, I changed that. If you can scroll down to this part of the PowerPoint, you have the sensory motor, you have sorry, I'm trying to get it to stay. The sensory motor, you have the pre-operation, the concrete operational, and formal operational. So those are the different stages of cognitive development. So the sensory stage, which is infancy, is really all about the egocentricity of the child and understanding and creating schemas based on their sensory input, right? They're very tactile. Children excuse me, in infancy really create a lot of their mental schemas through their putting things in their mouths and smelling things, so their basic senses are the way that they create the schemas of the world. As they begin to age and they go through toddlerhood and early childhood, they struggle with something called object permanence. And so their mental representation of the world is based on the physical ability to see or touch or taste or see something, or smell something, hear something, etc. So when you encounter children who often have a hard time with attachment, right? So this is how some of our theories begin to mesh with each other. Oftentimes it's because cognitively a child is not able to understand the dimension of time or the permanence of an object, such that if that object is no longer part of their visual field, then they do not understand that that object continues to exist. So that's, for example, when you're interacting with a young child and you put a blanket over a ball, for example. If the child doesn't look for the ball under the blanket, then they have not established object permanence in their cognitive processing, because they don't realize that that ball would still exist underneath of the blanket. As we move along, we get into elementary and early adolescence. This is concrete operational, still a very concrete process, similar to that in the pre-operational, and things like abstract thought processes like mass and volume and weight are difficult for them to understand, which is why sometimes if you give a child two containers of water and one of them is a taller glass and the other one is a shorter glass, even if they contain the same amount of water, they may not be able to abstractly understand that something that is bigger does not mean more. By the time they get into adolescence and adulthood, according to Piaget, formal operational thinking has taken place, and so they are able to then understand that there are abstract thought processes, and so they're able to understand things like mass and weight, which lends to the possibility of a child, an adolescent and adult being able to understand ultimate possibilities, and so you're able to have cognitive conversations with people at that age about the possibility of changing or being something different from what they currently are. And this is an important part of the cognitive process when we're thinking about the possibility of changing behaviors. If you're not in a cognitive space to be able to understand all of the abstract possibilities of your life, it's going to be very difficult for you to be able to conceptualize the possibility of changing your behaviors in such a way as to be able to define yourself in a new way, and define yourself in the way you would choose to be defined. If we move back to understanding this idea of schemas and thinking about how we change things, right, and change our schemas depending on where we are in our cognitive stage of development, a child is more or less able to assimilate through to accommodation. So we think about when you have this new concept, cognitively, depending on the stage of development, you're able to either assimilate new information into your existing schema, or if this new situation creates a disequilibrium with your current schemas, you have a choice of whether to assimilate or accommodate that new information and create, therefore, a new schema. And so this is kind of a nice representation of what happens when you have a new situation and the cognitive thought processes that move us through to creation of and reevaluation of schema. And so this is part of our therapeutic process when we think about how do we help clients be able to navigate situations that are contradictory to their emotions or thought processes, and be able to use cognitive interventions to help them begin to reevaluate the situation in a way that they can make a decision to change the behavior or change the way they think about something or change the way they feel about a particular situation, so that they're creating a new schema, or that they accept and understand this particular feeling or emotion as part of their schema and thought process and then assimilate it. So if we move on to then thinking about behavior theory, and if you want to look at this particular link, it talks to Professor Laszlo, who is a pretty important behavior theorist who talks about the work of Wolpe and the sensory research that was happening in South Africa, which was particularly interesting if you're interested in behavior theory. There are two types, as I'm sure you remember from learning in behavior and human behavior in the social environment: classical or response conditioning, or operant and instrumental conditioning. The classical conditioning is where you have the antecedent that shapes the behavior, not the consequences. So you have an unconditioned stimuli and an unconditioned response, such as the unconditioned stimuli is food and the unconditioned response is salivation, hence Pavlov's dogs. When you add the bell into Pavlov's dogs, you have the pairing of the bell with the unconditioned stimuli, and then you have a conditioned response, so that when the bell rings, the dogs salivate, hence the conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. As we move along to operant conditioning, the behavior is learned after the behavior occurs. And so you have the stimulus, then the response, and the reinforcer, right? So if a child does their homework and they're positively praised for it, the child will continue to do their homework, hopefully, right? That's a behavior shaper or a reinforcer of behaviors. There are multiple types of reinforcements, however. There's positive reinforcement where you add something good and the behavior continues or increases. If you add something bad, i.e. punishment, then the behavior ceases or stops. If you remove, such as extinction, a behavior, a positive addition, and the behavior